Hello and welcome back to Sinobabble. Today's episode is another rant. Back when I was a wee lass, I was trying to decide what career path I would pursue after my studies, and I essentially settled on three potential options: academia, think tank employee, or somebody who works in academic publishing. I was quickly disabused of the first option within about 6 months of doing my PhD, and so I decided to pursue the other two routes. It was only when I actually started applying for think tanks that I realized that I didn't actually know what a think tank was. Like, I had an idea in my mind as to what it was and what think tank people did. I thought the main purpose of a think tank was essentially to provide ongoing analysis of geopolitical events, either from an economic or social political perspective, and then to provide policy analysis and recommendations to governments or governing bodies. However, the more I looked into it, the more I realized that this was not actually the case. Although this is what think tanks purport to do on the surface, when I actually looked at their outputs, the kind of research reports, books that they were publishing, I realized that there was almost no value in what think tanks did, even less value, if you can imagine it, than what the average academic puts out. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about think tanks today. This idea actually came from a subscriber who suggested it, but it reminded me of this time when I was interested in working for think tanks and kind of coming to that realization that think tanks provide almost no value to society and may actually be worthless. And I wanted to share that with you. As always, first of all, let's start with a little bit of context. What actually is a think tank? So this is the definition of think tanks according to politics.co.uk. Think tanks are research and advocacy institutions that publish advice on a range of social, political, and economic issues in the hopes of influencing policymakers and power holders. The focus is often on finding innovative solutions, generating insight, and hitting on the next big idea. Each think tank operates with a particular focus and has a vision of society in particular. Think tanks often operate independently of a political party, but they frequently form close links. We can tack on a little bit of Oxford University's definition from their career page as well. Think tanks are usually identified with particular positions on the political spectrum, such as left, centrist, right, etc. They're not usually overtly campaigning organisations. They use media and direct contacts with senior leaders in their sector to disseminate their work. They can initiate their own work and seek funding or conduct research at the behest of a third party, and they are generally funded from charitable and/or corporate sources. So there are two kind of aspects that I want to tackle when it comes to talking about think tanks' China analysis. The first is from that first definition that we read, which is the idea of trying to hit on the next big thing when it comes to China. With China becoming an increasingly important entity over the past 2 to 3 decades, the idea of hitting on the next big China revelation, whether that be China is going to become a democracy or go through more market liberalization or whatever it might be, people within think tanks or the think tank is essentially trying to gamble on the person who predicted that outcome and therefore become the next big reliable think tank that organizations or leaders or governing bodies or whomever can rely on for that information. So making these predictions, gambling on the future, is a way of upping their own street cred, if you will. The other thing that I want to talk about, which directly stems from that, therefore, is the actual value of the outputs that think tanks put out. I remember when I first started looking into think tanks, I kind of assumed that the way that it worked was that the experts within them would every 3 to 6 months sort of sit down, conduct a big research project or something like that, or a discussion, and put all of that work together in a big white paper, which they would then disseminate to whoever subscribed to their feeds. This is absolutely not the case. The churn of reports, articles, newsletters, podcasts, little pieces, blog posts, whatever it is that comes out of these think tanks is innumerable. Which is another thing that we'll get to as well. I didn't go through every single think tank in the world, obviously. I mainly focused on Western think tanks. I mainly focused on the big ones, just for the sake of brevity and being able to give a good snapshot into what we're looking at here. There is a spreadsheet which does have a color scheme. I did put a lot of effort into this, okay? It was incredibly stressful. So what I wanted to do with this episode was essentially chart think tank China analysis starting in the 90s, 1991 to be precise, and going up to 2004. The reason that I chose this time period is because if you are going to make a prediction about something, particularly about, say, whether a country will democratize or not, I think 30 years is long enough for that prediction to come true. I'm giving them a little buffer of 33 years here. 1991 is also a year of some great significance in the world. It's the year that the Soviet Union finally collapses. It's the year that the Gulf War comes to an end. It's the year that I was born. So 1991, I feel like is a good place to stop. And then 20 years before today, so 2004, if you made a prediction about China and it didn't come true, then I'm afraid your time is up. And if you did make a prediction and it did come true, then something else that we need to explore is whether or not that prediction actually has any inherent value. Did it, say, come into play when it came to policy making for US leaders, for example? Or is it just part of this greater churn of information that we see coming out of think tanks? So before we actually jump into the content that these think tanks put out, I wanted to talk a little bit about how I went through the selection process. So obviously some places have more think tanks than others, mainly places that produce more PhD graduates than the economy can actually absorb efficiently. So think the US, North America, the UK, Europe mainland, especially Western Europe. A lot of Western PhDs just out of jobs these days. Some of the bigger think tanks do have dedicated China centers, but in the period that we're looking at, most of them are just winging it. They have like a few China policy experts, a lot of whom are borrowed from universities. They kind of go back and forth between them. A lot of them are actually professors of, say, economics or Asian history or Asian politics. I am specifically talking only about organizations that identify as think tanks in this episode. I'm not talking about university departments, even though some of them have juicy revelations when it comes to their affiliations with the CCP. The reason that I'm excluding them is because the purpose of a university department and the purpose of a think tank are very different. Universities are ivory tower houses for academics to spend years reading old dusty books and then throwing their research into the void, only to be picked up by other professors who will cite that work, or students from undergraduate courses who need something to cite for their end of year papers. Think tank output is supposed to directly influence both public opinion and policy making. Very, very different. Obviously there's a crossover there, but the explicit purpose of the two bodies is different. So we're only talking about think tanks today. We can talk about how useful Chinese academia is just in another episode. Something else that we should discuss is the stated mission of think tanks. I'm just going to use a few examples from the very big think tanks that come up quite often here. I was going to talk about political leanings, but as I got into the episode, it became more and more apparent that that wasn't going to be necessary. The political leanings of these organizations does not matter for reasons that will reveal themselves later on. However, the stated mission of these institutions is important because your mission should directly relate to the information that you're putting out into the world. And so it's useful for us to bear these sorts of grander aims in mind when we're looking at outputs to see if there is actually any link between the two, or if the mission is just kind of fluff, essentially, and an excuse to ask for money from big charitable donors. So the largest think tanks that I ended up looking at were the Rand Corporation, AEI, the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and the Carnegie Endowment. All of these are American institutes. They call themselves global institutes, but global in this case is just a euphemism for headquartered in the US, has offices in Singapore. America was actually the first to develop this think tank model. It actually began with the Carnegie Endowment, but we're going to start by looking at the Rand Corporation because that was the first time I think that the word think tank was actually used. The Rand Corporation was founded in 1948 after post-war conversations between some US military bigwigs revealed the need for a private organization to connect operational research with research and development decisions. Again, it brands itself as a global institution, but it gets around 3/4 of its funding from the US government. And in this case, its ties to the US government, the US military industrial complex, are explicit. The Rand Corporation was founded first and then it split off into a think tank. So that's also something that should be borne in mind. They're apparently left of centre. Again, it doesn't matter. And also, as a Brit, if you're in a US company and you're left of centre, that just means you're right wing to me. I'm really sorry. And their stated mission is to improve policy and decision making through research and analysis. Their research and analysis addresses issues that impact people around the world, including security, health, education, sustainability, growth, and development. If we look at another one, say the Carnegie Endowment, this is supposedly another left of centre think tank. It was founded in 1910 by Andrew Carnegie from an endowment that he left. Andrew Carnegie being like one of the richest men in American history, is like the grandfather of modern day capitalism. The full name of the institute is the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and its mission is to generate strategic ideas and independent analysis to help countries and institutions take on the most difficult global problems and advance peace. The American Enterprise Institute, also known as AEI, is another US think tank founded in 1938 and our first hard-coded right-wing think tank. Good for them. So their mission is dedicated to defending human dignity, expanding human potential, building a freer and safer world. The work advances ideas rooted in the belief that democracy, free enterprise, American strength and global leadership, solidarity with those at the periphery of society, and a pluralistic entrepreneurial culture. AEI, in comparison to the others, is much more deliberately focused on American values, American moral values, and American values around democracy. The Foreign Policy Research Institute is another right of centre, but not as right-wing as AEI think tank. It was founded in 1955, and its mission is to produce the highest quality scholarship and non-partisan political analysis focused on crucial foreign policy and national security challenges facing the US. We educate those who make and influence policy, as well as the public at large, through the lens of history, geography, and culture. So again, this one is explicitly focused on US policy making, US decision making, even though they're all global institutes. But again, global just means US. So the missions vary slightly, and so do the political leanings, but essentially the purpose of these organizations is to create actionable insights that policymakers can then apply to real world problems. So we're going to put a pin in that kind of mission statement idea because it's going to become very important when we're looking at the overall analysis at the end. So in my research, I went through lots of different databases, places like Policy Commons. I ended up trawling through over 6,000 results between 1991 and 2004. Now, you may not think that's a lot, considering that covers almost a 15-year period. However, that's just on the topic of China. So remember that all of these think tanks cover multiple areas of analysis: politics and governance, society, culture, poverty, climate change, science, technology. Now they would have all added AI departments. These are very broad institutions that do a lot of research. They get a lot of funding, like I've mentioned, and all of that funding goes into like churning out documents on these different topics. So even though 6,000 doesn't seem like that much, considering the length of time, it could be orders of magnitude more, hundreds of thousands, from just a handful of institutions in that period on every single topic that you could think of. Also, we have to be careful when we're looking at this period of time not to project China's current global significance onto this time period, especially in the period before 2001, and particularly in 1991. China was not as important as it is now. It wasn't even the most important country in Asia, probably not even in East Asia, even though it was a large country and it was of growing importance. And obviously the fact that it was communist made it important to the US. So it makes sense that there's not a huge glut of articles produced about China, unlike what we would see today, where China would probably be the main focus and a lot of Asian countries would have fallen by the wayside in comparison. Let's now look at some of the pieces that have been written between 1991 and 2004. I'm going to break them down into chunks. So we're going to start with the period 1991 to 1995. So like I said, I read and sort of went through a lot of documents. A lot of them I didn't read all the way through, but I did read quite a lot for this episode. I'm not going to talk about every single thing that I read. I'm just going to pick out a few bits and pieces to give like a flavor of what China analysis was like at the time. So if we're talking about 1991 to 1995, I'd say overall this first period is kind of tame, a bit reserved. There aren't too many outlandish predictions like we get a little bit later on. When I was analysing the pieces, I broke things down into correct or true, foreshadowing, so neither incorrect nor correct, but kind of like, that's going to be important later. And then just very, very wrong. So wrong, incredibly wrong. This should have come back to haunt you at some point in your career, kind of wrong. So most of the pieces in this period fall into the foreshadowing category. A good example would be a piece called Congage, China, which was published by Rand, and it was written by the US diplomat Zalmay Khalilzad, who's an American diplomat and foreign policy expert, and was actually appointed by Trump as a representative for the Afghanistan reconciliation and kind of helped orchestrate the US's withdrawal from Afghanistan. So somebody who does have influence in US policy making. So he wrote that the purpose of the piece is to find a posture that can encourage positive evolution in China's relations with the world and appropriately respond to negative behaviour in the short term, whilst also protecting the US against the possibility that in the longer term, China may embark on a hostile course. The last two administrations have both described their strategy towards China as one of engagement. However, in reality, there's a fundamental lack of consensus on what strategy can best achieve these purposes. I think what becomes evident in reading this piece and other pieces like it is that analysts at this time had a very good understanding of where China stood at the time. China had just come out of a very turbulent period with the Tiananmen protests and also with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Communism in general is kind of in a rough place. And he's also got a very good understanding of China's perspective on the US, which is that the US is kind of trying to limit China's power to an extent, trying to manage their rise, and that could be a problem when China's trying to make larger international moves like reunification with Taiwan. There is that prediction that will come up time and time again that China will probably have to democratize or at least go through some large-scale political reform in order for the CCP to survive. This is kind of a vibe check at this point. He's not saying it outright. Something that he does do that a lot of other people do is that he makes this huge underestimation of China's growth capabilities, particularly in the area of technology. If current trends hold, by 2020, China is likely to emerge as a formidable multidimensional regional power as it continues to trade quantity for quality, increase defense spending, pursue innovation, and mature its industrial base. Such a capability is likely to put China in a much stronger position to pursue its interests and perhaps threaten East Asia, but it is unlikely to be able to catch up with the US across the board and on a global basis before 2050. It's difficult to say whether this is an underestimation of China or an overestimation of the US. Obviously, at this point, you haven't had large-scale economic crises like we see in 2008. You haven't had the shift of manufacturing from the US and other places in Asia almost centrally to China. So there's lots of developments to come, which is why, in general, I think making these sorts of predictions, especially when it comes to the economy or technology, is very difficult because, as we know, since the early 20th century, technological progress it's increased exponentially as opposed to linearly. So it's very risky to make that kind of prediction about where China's future technology is going to be based on where it was in the 90s. And obviously I say that with hindsight, but it's just not something that, based on the previous 30 years, I would be comfortable making a prediction about for the next 30 years, if that makes sense. What's interesting is that this type of prediction doesn't really change actually over time. Like, people continue to say the same things about China's technology or China's military. There's just this sense that the US will be able to maintain its lead over China. I don't know if that's based on like contemporary understanding of the US global hegemony, or the fact that most of these places are actually, the majority of them are funded by US federal institutions. But there's definitely a misperception of China's place in Asia and also globally. Another piece has the quote, "China seems to be slower to recognize the changed climate in Asia. It's torn between its desires to be a great power and its goals of remaining a third world leader with great influence. China's neighbours are wary of Beijing, but are probably more comfortable with a stronger China than they would be with an increase in strength by Japan." Which I'm sure was true at the time, but I would just love to hear from those leaders now, those neighbours, and ask them, you know, who do you think's a bigger threat now, China or Japan? A lot of pieces in this period are focused on how US policy towards China will and should evolve in light of China's rapid growth. So another Rand piece, which was written by economist Charles Goldman, states that despite President Clinton's attempt to construct a more balanced policy, his failure to articulate an overall vision for China leaves a policy vulnerable to domination once again by a single interest. Though there is reduced risk that small-scale violations of human rights will derail US-China relations, the relationship remains highly prone to a reversal sparked by contention over US relations with Taiwan, proliferation of military technology to Pakistan or Iran, or a major human rights violation. In addition, increased commercial interactions are certain to spur new conflicts over economics. In contrast to the rosy optimism that prevailed during 1993 and 1994, the tenor of media reports on business prospects in China has become much more negative. The dominance of economic interests over human rights against this background of troubling publicity could lead to a pattern of escalating economic friction that mirrors US policy towards Japan. So here the author is specifically talking about a decision made by the Clinton administration in 1994 to de-link trade with China from its human rights record. De-link, unlink, I'm not sure what the correct phrase, like disconnect them, basically. This is a huge turning point in US-China relations, and it has consequences that we will see echoing through later discussions as well. In terms of China's economics and sort of growing sphere of influence, there's actually a piece that basically predicts the Belt and Road Initiative. It's important to note at the outset that the impact of China's economic surge is magnified by the simultaneous collapse of the Soviet Union, with the result that the increases in China's relative and absolute power vis-a-vis its neighbours have both been enormous. Much of Laos is following in Burma's footsteps. China began building roads in northern Laos a decade ago, primarily for military purposes, where Laotian communists were still contending for power. But now growth-hungry officials in Yunnan are making major strides in their plans to transform Laos into the major transportation link between China and Southeast Asia. This is something that's still happening today. That rail link is very, very important. The piece goes on to say that the leaders agreed northwestern regions should seize good opportunities to take full advantage of their geographical advantages in opening the countries and regions west of China's northwest, jointly build a greater international passage in the northwest, and make joint westward advances. What is particularly noteworthy is that China's advances in all three regions are peaceful, economic, and non-coercive. Neighbouring countries eager for the fruits of China's economic takeoff sometimes seem more enthusiastic than China itself. So here he's directly foreshadowing something that's not going to happen for like 20 years, which is the official announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative. But this kind of piece is historically important because it shows that this was not a spur of the moment thing. This isn't something that China came up with in 2012 when Xi Jinping came to power. This is something that's been in the works for a very long time. This kind of piece should have been used in further analysis to kind of show that China is like a long-term thinker. It's a kind of thing that in and of itself has a lot of value, has a lot of gems in it, but it's standalone. It doesn't go anywhere. And I may be wrong, but I can't see what value it has provided in foreign policy development towards China. If you were a leader who had read this in conjunction with many other pieces, or if it had been part of a white paper, say, analysing China's economic growth and its potential expansion in other directions, you may be thinking, well, this might be a long-term plan of China's to connect with countries around it and potentially forge passages that go as far as Europe or, deep into Southeast Asia, and therefore should be something that if I am the current hegemon imperialist ruler of the world, i.e. the US, I should be concerned about, and I should be making sure that my links with those countries are good, or discussing with their leaders what their plans with China are. But it doesn't seem to have been something that was really on their radar. And I think that it's in part because of the piecemeal nature of think tank pieces. Like, this is just one piece written by one guy for the Foreign Policy Institute. It's not part of a grander narrative coming out of their analysis. It doesn't help that there are a lot of other pieces that are coming out from the same institutions or similar institutions that are very guilty of preempting massive political reform or just straight up regime change in China. So one piece by Jan Pribilia, who was an economics professor, who, writing for the AEI in 1991, said that while China wasn't likely to democratize or make any sort of political reform, this also meant that its economy wouldn't be able to liberalize or really do well to any extent because it's restricted by the communist authoritarianism of the ruling party. Since socialism cannot be reformed without being abandoned, and given the undiminished will to power of the vanguard elite of the monocratic party, the chances of real reform from the side of economics are very slim, and the chances of reform from the side of politics are practically nil. That is to say, there is little, if any, likelihood that economic freedom, political freedom, and democracy will emerge as a result of reformist measures undertaken by those in power. Tinkering with the system notwithstanding, the shortage, inefficiency, repressed antagonism will persist and probably grow worse. Sooner or later, society's disequilibrium has to be corrected, either through centralized planning and socialization of the economy, or through the democratization of politics. Deterministic predictions aside, chances are that the market argument will prevail because a failure to keep and develop the market system will ultimately reduce any political power to irrelevance. On the scale of human values, while the economic argument may not be the most important, it is the single most powerful. In short, once the market system is in place, protected and encouraged by even a non-democratic political system, it will tend to permeate the political realm with its ideas of freedoms and its democratic assumptions, eventually weaning away that realm from authoritarianism. This kind of prediction isn't just wrong, it's like completely wrong. It's the opposite of correct. It is not what happened at all. And like I said, it's been 30 years, so if it was going to happen, it would have happened by now. When he's talking about the liberalization of the governance, the weaning away of authoritarianism, he's not talking about the Chinese Communist Party's version of democracy. He defines democracy earlier on in his book as the institutionalization of political freedom in a secret ballot, unrigged electoral contest of open alternatives on the basis of universal suffrage. So he's talking about direct democracy here. So he believes that it's got to be one or the other, right? Either you have an authoritarian system with a state-controlled, centrally controlled economy, or you have a market economy with democratic governance. And he's wrong about that. And if that's something that decision makers are taking seriously, in conjunction with another article that's just said China is making close links with its neighbours around it in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union in order to expand its sphere of influence, which one of those are you supposed to take more seriously? They're saying the complete opposite things. It goes even further when those who are trying to sort of warn about China's future are basically arguing that China is going to start facing a crisis within a few years, and that crisis may lead to the collapse of the governing system. Arthur Wardren, who was the former director of Asian studies within the AIE and very much not a fan of China, wrote in 1995, this time for the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that domestically, none of the basic causes have been removed that produced the democracy movement and Tiananmen massacre of 5 years ago. neither the grievances of the people nor the inflexibility of the government. Internationally, China's neighbours are increasingly dissatisfied by Beijing's almost total lack of flexibility in dealing with territorial disputes and worried by its steady military build-up. It's no exaggeration to say that China's present situation, if it's projected without change into the future, must provoke some sort of crisis within a few years, yet despite such possibilities, US policymakers can sometimes seem blandly optimistic about both the future of the PRC and Asia in general. Also writing for the Foreign Policy Research Institute, Larry Wartzel writes, China is not playing wholeheartedly in the New World Order, nor is it posturing itself for an order of multi-level interdependence. It seems locked in a pre-Cold War, almost turn-of-the-century mode of quasi-imperial competition for regional hegemony, and has embarked on a new long march to become the first among roughly equal powers that can enjoy freedom of action. When China was isolated and held itself apart from the world economy, its interests were naturally continental. Since the US opened relations with China in 1972, a consistent goal of US policy has been to draw China more deeply into the world economy. The US strategy has certainly succeeded, but its very success is a factor in the shift of the Chinese security interests. On the one hand, you have pieces like that are saying it's the US's fault that China has been brought more into the global system, and China is not interested in playing in that system as we would expect it to. It's actually going to pursue its own interests and will continue on its own path, compared with others who are basically predicting that the more China is brought into the global system, the more likely it is to have to change its form of governance or its market system in order to get along nicely with everyone else, essentially. But already we're starting to see that there are differences in opinion, which is absolutely fine. But the problems of that analysis, first of all, being very piecemeal, and secondly, differing opinions emerging from the same institution, which is supposed to have the same goal or mission, these sorts of issues are starting to appear here. But overall, I would say that the pieces in this early period are pretty good. They have good China knowledge. They're not too gung-ho in their democratic predictions. They're there, but, people are being a bit circumspect, if you will. It's actually the middle to late 1990s where I start to lose hope a little bit. As China's economy grows, its importance in the world grows, so too does analysis of China grow and its tendrils reach ever deeper into the public consciousness, and things start getting messy in think tank land, particularly because nobody can really agree where China is going next. There's a lot more analysis on China's military, whether or not they're going to be able to expand either their nuclear or general military capabilities to the same size as the US. Everyone agrees that the Spratly Islands are a long-term objective, but that China will probably refrain from taking any direct action for the foreseeable future. Also, now that we are in the foreseeable future, I guess China has decided that its military is strong enough. So again, it's difficult to summarize these more neutral reports because when you have an analysis that basically says something like, only weakness at China's center could enable Xinjiang to break away on the periphery. Although it is unclear whether Beijing will weaken, China's political structure is seemingly less certain now than it was before. That doesn't provide anything of value when you're thinking about how to deal with the Xinjiang issue, or even trying to think about whether or not there will be a Xinjiang issue. It's dependent on so many interdependent factors, whether Beijing will be weak or strong, which is dependent on whether the economy will be weak or strong. It's also dependent on how China treats its minority groups, how strong or thinly stretched the military is, whether or not there are skirmishes with other countries, whether or not they get in a deadlock with the US over Taiwan. These neutral, piecemeal, useless pieces of information don't actually provide any value. It's kind of just yapping. I do like this one piece by Joseph Cirincione, I don't know if I'm saying that right, apologies, I'm bad at Italian, who says that China will modernize its nuclear forces and conventional military forces, but it's so far behind the US and our allies that America's military leaders conclude unanimously that China would not represent a serious military threat to the US for at least 20 years. And here we are 20 years later, and China is presenting a serious military threat to the US, hence the AUKUS deal and several other issues that are arising in the South China Sea. But again, this type of information, it's more akin to that ivory tower academic literature than it is to useful think tank advice for policy and governance leaders. One paper does actually hit on this very problem. A seminar that was conducted by the Congressional Research Service hosted a bunch of different leaders from the Department of Defense, different universities, and also Arthur Waldron, who we mentioned earlier is not a fan of China, to kind of discuss what the US's policy should be towards China. And in this seminar summary, it says, participants judged that historical experience suggests the US will be unable to reach a grand bargain or lasting solution to China challenges. Rather, the US leaders will need to devote continuous high-level policy attention, issue by issue, case by case, in order to both deter Chinese assertiveness and to encourage Chinese accommodation. In particular, the administration's ability to establish lasting understandings with Chinese leaders and build a consensus in the US depends on clarity, credibility, and consistency. The alternative is seen as vacillation and drift, whereby the US may be forced to resort to extraordinary means, including use of force, in order to clarify its intentions in the face of growing pressure from China. So it's basically admitting that there is no way to hard code a China policy. You kind of just have to wing it depending on what's going on, which is really all the advice that you need. Anything else that's trying to predict the future, anything that's not basically just giving you a lay of the land in China and kind of explaining in excruciating detail what China is doing right now and what that means for the US in this moment is not useful. And even those things are limited in their usefulness simply because they conflict with one another a lot of the time, even within a single institution. For example, that piece was written in 1996. Then the same Arthur Waldron comes out in 1998 and says this: my prognosis is that the current Chinese administration is not going to move quickly enough to make political changes that its already very successful economic reforms require. The result will be an increasingly tense and disorderly situation inside China. Although economic and social change in China has been so rapid and extensive that the country now finds itself at the point where some government opening up to the people is inescapable, the signs from Beijing are that no such opening is being prepared. The society that China has become today can no longer be ruled autocratically. Its people must be involved in the making of laws and legitimating authority. That means the sort of liberalization we have seen elsewhere in Asia and in the former Soviet bloc. To stand against this tide in China is to risk chaos and catastrophe. What happened to clarity and consistency? This isn't just two different people within the same organization disagreeing on how US policy should be approached. It's literally the same person within a 2-year period being like, I don't think you can hard code a China policy, and then 2 years later being like, actually, this is what's going to happen in China. I think it's a bit much to switch from being China is unpredictable to China can be predicted and it's going to be a democracy. These are the types of things that should haunt you throughout your career and people should be bringing up regularly and pointing out to you. This period in general is very much peak China will have to become a democracy or the CCP will fall to its knees era. There's lots of feeling that internally China is on the brink of collapse. This is despite the fact that we're getting further and further away in time from the collapse of the Soviet Union. And it's kind of treated as if the CCP must adopt democracy wholesale in order to preserve its rule. The main perpetrator of this is my arch nemesis for the purposes of this episode, a man called Min Shin-pei, who was chosen as one of the top 100 public intellectuals in 2008, and yet everything that I've read from him has simply enraged me, so I'm not sure how that's the case. So anyway, this is a piece that he wrote in 1999. Even if the Chinese government gets through 1999 without a repeat of 1989, it must soon confront the issue of political reform more seriously because the challenges it poses will only increase as time passes. If no significant institutional change is undertaken, China will experience rising tensions that its current political system will be incapable of handling. Failure to reform will allow corruption to worsen, inequality to rise, and poor governance to persist, eventually causing a massive social explosion such as occurred in Indonesia in May of 1998. Now, I didn't bother to look up what happened in Indonesia in 1998. Apologies for the poor level of research. However, I can tell you that there was no massive explosion of social upheaval or whatever he thinks is going to happen. There was no repeat of Tiananmen. There have been mini protests, large-scale protests in China every single year in the tens of thousands since 1989. However, none of those have caused the CCP to liberalize to any degree. If anything, it's only hardened the party's attitudes towards authoritarianism, i.e. authoritarianism is the only choice for China, and the CCP is the only body capable of leading China to a glorious future. Once again, if you make a prediction and it hasn't happened within 20 to 30 years, your prediction is incorrect. That is the metric that we are using for this episode. At one point, I was starting to lose hope that I would read anything of value at all, until one man alone was able to restore my faith in think tank analysis, even if it was only just a little tiny bit. This man is a man called Robert Kagan. He is apparently a neoconservative who doesn't sound like an overly pleasant individual from the descriptions that I read of him. He is reported to have said about the Iraq war, quote, "Bombing Iraq isn't enough," and called on President Clinton to send ground troops to Iraq. And also said that, quote, Saddam Hussein was supporting the existence of a terrorist training camp in Iraq, complete with a Boeing 707 for practicing hijackings and filled with non-Iraqi radical Muslims, a claim that was later proved to be false. But his harsh critique of US foreign policy finds a very comfortable home in his commentary on China. In a piece called Money Trap, he critiques the Clinton administration's decision to delink human rights and trade in 1994, stating that, quote, "Journalists and experts have consistently described the Clinton administration's famous reversal of its policy as an intellectual maturation, but that's a lot of nonsense." William H. Overholt, a political risk analyst for Bankers Trust in Hong Kong and one of the most effective spokesmen for commercial engagement with China, advises the US to spur economic development. Educated people will demand more freedom than uneducated people. People in a complex, highly differentiated modern economy will have more freedom than in a peasant economy because the government will have more difficulty controlling them. Such claims for the magical powers of American business abroad are so extravagant that they would have made Calvin Coolidge blush. The vast majority of educated Americans are persuaded that history, for all intents and purposes, really has ended. They can no longer imagine war between great powers or the possibility of a successful tyranny. The recent past has been reinterpreted to fit this pervasive sense of historical inevitability. The many complex and unpredictable factors that came together to produce the collapse of the Soviet Union have all melted into one long causal chain of economic determinism. The common account of the Soviet Union's demise is now pleasingly simple. It was the beauty of capitalism that killed the beast. Politics was only an expression of economics. I need you to understand that this is actually a god-tier take from this gentleman right here. Like, if you had to convince me that time travel existed and that people were coming from the future to the past to warn us about what was going to happen next, I would believe you if you presented this man's writing to me as evidence. This is what he says about the handover of Hong Kong to China in 1997. Since the beginning of 1997, Beijing and the man it has appointed to be Hong Kong's chief executive, C.H. Tung, have been rewriting Hong Kong's laws to put new restrictions on political activity and free speech. The Hong Kong canary is already short of breath as the PRC coal mine closes in around it. By the time you wake up to find that political liberties have been extinguished, it would be too late. This is him writing at a time when people thought that the effect of the integration of Hong Kong into China would actually go the other way around, that Hong Kong's democratic, free market society would have this liberating effect on China. Now that we're in the future, we know that the opposite is true and that Kagan's prediction is actually the correct one. But obviously people aren't listening to him or taking this sort of critique seriously, as he writes himself. The advocates of engagement, who we might call the new China hands, offer a host of sunny assumptions about China's future and the helpful role the US can play in shaping it. China wants to join our international order, the theory goes, and can be persuaded to play a responsible role in the world if we only help China's leaders understand what's good for them. By engaging with China, we can affect how the Chinese define their interest, and the Chinese come to view the world within the larger context we provide them. But the Chinese have no intention of accepting integration. on American terms. Chinese leaders want the world to accept Chinese characteristics as part of the price of having the country join international councils. Though a new player, China wants to be a rule setter and not a rule acceptor. For China's rulers, demanding that international norms be changed is a simple matter of survival. Their own, not their ancient nations. The system we uphold, and into which we would like to bring the Chinese, is deadly for them. Kagan's analysis actually reveals the biggest problem of all with the exercise of analysing think tank policy output. In all of the pieces that I've quoted, Kagan is writing for the Carnegie Endowment. But of course, there are other researchers who are writing for the Carnegie Endowment at exactly the same time. And in fact, we've already pointed out some of these writings. They are the writings that I mentioned that say the complete opposite of what Kagan is saying. Some of the points we haven't picked up on, for example, Kagan believes that the Cox report is real, whereas Cirincione argues that it's propaganda. The Cox report being the report that came out that stated that China had been stealing US nuclear secrets in order to build up its own nuclear arsenal. Another thing that Kagan disagrees with others about is whether or not China will democratize. Min Shin-pei argues that China has to go through political reform in order to survive, whereas Kagan says that China will become more authoritarian and will in fact try and shape international political events to its own will. These people are not writing dozens of years apart. They are writing within the same few years. Some of them are even written within the same year, and yet they're saying exactly the opposite thing, despite writing for exactly the same institution. What does it mean when your organization doesn't have an internal logic or even a consistent belief system about how the topic that you're analyzing is going to evolve over time? How am I, the hypothetical leader of the free world, supposed to use your advisory services if your own people are spouting completely opposing information and recommendations? At this point, it's not even about who's right or wrong, because again, we're in the past, hypothetically, so we don't know who's right or wrong yet. This hasn't been revealed. But you should, at least within your own company, be able to decide who is right and who is wrong. Otherwise, how can you claim to be advising anyone? From 2000 to 2004, things just continue along a similar vein, essentially. Unsurprisingly, this is the period where we get more and more writing about China, covers the period where China enters the World Trade Organization, and in 2003, when their economic growth hits double-digit figures. If you think that we've left accusations that China is suddenly going to sprout a democratic government behind safely in the 20th century where it belongs, you would be absolutely wrong about that. The Committee for Economic Development, which is an organisation that has been credited with developing the Marshall Plan, God bless them, in the year of our Lord 2000, wrote the following. We urge Congress to approve the permanent normal trade relations status for China. We believe that China's entry into the World Trade Organization and PNTR relations with China would have a substantial long-term political, economic, and national security benefit for the US. We fear that rejection of PNTR would harm the US consumers, workers, and businesses that benefit from trade with China. Exports to China will raise the incomes of US producers and workers. Sorry, I didn't mean to be laughing, but since jobs supported by exports pay about 15% more than average, as World Trade membership strengthens the rule of law in China, it will erode the arbitrary use of power by individual leaders. As it strengthens competition, it will weaken state monopolies and spur entrepreneurship. WTO membership will increase foreign participation in the Chinese economy, exposing more Chinese people to ideas and information from outside. Such changes will encourage private initiatives of various kinds, including the development of independent civil organizations such as private trade unions. Moving swiftly onwards. My arch nemesis, Min Shin-pei, is continuing to just say things. He writes that to sustain economic reform, China needs to establish and enforce laws that would significantly curtail the CCP's power. The preservation of a one-party state and the implementation of rule of law are fundamentally incompatible. If not soon reversed through political reform, these trends will threaten the sustainability of China's economic modernization and even its internal stability. China's new leaders face a dilemma. The regime needs to open up its political system to help ameliorate rising tensions between it and society, despite the high risks of taking this step in the face of its weak legitimacy and brewing social discontent. Inaction will only exacerbate the emerging governance crisis. China could descend into long-term stagnation with slow economic growth, mounting social ills, and an incapacitated state. Like whatever, you know? It's not even that he might be right or wrong. It's just a lot of mights, shoulds, and coulds. It's like, is China going to become a democracy or not? Will it have to liberalize or not? There's no certainty, and therefore the value of what he's saying is not evident. I'm not going through these pieces just to sort of like judge these people and say that I'm smarter than them. Obviously, I have the benefit of hindsight in this particular situation. It's more, again, just trying to point out the fact that predicting the future is pointless, because if you're wrong, any advice that you give is useless, obviously, and leaders will have made the wrong decision based off of your advice. And then even if you are right, you cannot be right with any degree of certainty. And therefore, any kind of advice that you're giving kind of feels a bit fair weather. And again, it doesn't help to advance policy making in any way. This is something that's actually picked up in one of the books that I read called China's Quest for Energy Security by Erica Strecker, which is a Rand Corporation publication. So she actually starts the book by making some fairly considered good predictions. If present trends hold, it is only by the period 2015 to 2020 at the earliest, and more likely 2020 to 2025, that China might begin an extended transition to a new security strategy. Growing Chinese power will most likely result over the very long term in a more assertive China. These elements include efforts to augment its military capabilities in a manner commensurate with its increased power, develop a sphere of influence by acquiring new allies and underwriting the protection of others, acquire new or reclaim old territory, prepare to redress past wrongs it believes it may have suffered, attempt to rewrite the prevailing international rules of the game to better reflect its own interests, and in the most extreme policy choice imaginable, even perhaps ready itself to thwart preventative war or to launch predatory attacks on its foes. So these are very solid, accurate predictions, but then she immediately goes on to sort of undermine everything that she's just said. Even if the rise of Chinese power and its associated assertiveness occur, however, both preemptive containment and preemptive appeasement strategies towards a rising China would be counterproductive. So long as there is some chance that the predicted outcome of assertiveness may not occur, US strategy ought neither to create the preconditions for its occurrence nor retreat in the expectation that its occurrence is inevitable. Who does this help? Exactly. Like, what is the point in writing a 300-page book about how China is going to expand militarily, become increasingly assertive and potentially even aggressive on the global stage, and then undermine the entire thing by being like, but that may not happen, so best not to do anything at all? Like, what kind of advice is that? There are good papers from this period, but at a certain point, it feels like there's just like a race to the bottom to make the most outlandish China prediction possible in order to kind of make the biggest splash. One guy even writes, China is sleepwalking towards becoming a market democracy. The argument here is that the CCP is in metamorphosis, verbally committed to continuity, but in effect committing slow political suicide by changing its inner nature while discarding its outer skin. Like, that may be true to an extent. Obviously, the Chinese Communist Party has had to discard some elements of its actual communism in order to adapt for survival. It doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as political suicide. And a market democracy, again, if it's been 20 years to 30 years, your time's up. If it's not even moving in that direction yet, you are wrong. When I said that Western think tank analysis on China was worthless or useless or whatever I've called this episode, you may think I'm being a bit harsh and like, well, you know, people are entitled to their opinions. After all, here I am having opinions about their opinions, which I totally get. And I'm not trying to be hypocritical here. The difference is that I'm not trying to influence public opinion. I'm not trying to influence public policy. I'm just yapping. I'm just telling you what's on my mind. But I don't think that this same mindset applies to think tanks. I think that think tank analysis should be a lot more solid and a lot less circumspect, especially if it's internally. Like, if you're one institution, you should really only have one opinion about China. I think the think tank landscape unfortunately mirrors all too closely the landscape that we have with information in general. We have a huge glut of just information out there. Everybody's got like news overload. The news is a 24-hour cycle. There's endless content on every single subject. It's very easy to get overwhelmed by the amount of information coming out there, and therefore it's not surprising to see that even within a single organization, researchers, think tank people, professors, whoever it is, are going in 100 different directions when it comes to their China analysis. To some extent, it kind of feels like some of them are trying to make a quick buck, in that they're trying to kind of appease the people who are funding them, and therefore trying to have an opinion on everything and trying to cover all of their bases with all of their opinions in order to make sure that the money keeps flowing. You know, you don't want to annoy any institution too much or any potential donor too much because they might lean politically one way, but if you're funded by multiple donors or multiple institutions, then you want to kind of keep all those broad avenues of funding sources open, right? They're kind of in a tricky political situation. It's easy for me to be like, oh, well, I'm objective and I don't like to lean one way or another on China because I don't have anyone funding me. I can say whatever I want to say because this is my channel. I don't have anyone funding me. I can say whatever I want to say, and no comments or emails or whatever you guys say is going to change how I feel about that. But if you are an institution that is funded by outside bodies, then you are to an extent beholden to those bodies, even if you claim to be objective in your analysis. My final point on this is the fact that there are so many articles coming out all the time from these think tanks on every aspect of China, and having lots of different interpretations. You know, this is good, this is bad, China will be a democracy or won't, is a bad thing because it allows larger media outlets to pick up on certain cherry-picked publications or studies or reports and then use those as news sources to create like panic or stir up hatred towards China. This is arguably like the dangerous side of how think tanks inform public policy or public opinion through their connections with the media. For example, my latest Substack was about a report that came out from a think tank that basically argued that China is shilling authoritarian forms of governance to developing countries by holding online seminars about blockchain. I won't get into it too much here because this episode is already way too long, but essentially it was a bunch of nonsense and I tried to debunk it in that Substack. So if you're interested in hearing even more about think tanks, then I suggest you go and read it because it's actually a good example of how one study by one person with their own conclusions and clear biases about China can go on to become news that is then taken on unreported by other news outlets and then is taken as fact. I personally don't take the news at face value. If you're a long-time listener, you know that I will take news from both China outlets and Western outlets with different political leanings, bring in academic research as well from China and from the West and from all over the world, just so that we can have like a proper, fully rounded perspective whenever we're talking about an issue to do with China. I think it's good never to have just one source of information, but that really only applies to content creation. I don't think it applies to think tanks in the same way. I think think tanks are contributing too much to the information overload that we're already experiencing in society. If anything, they could do with just like producing less, but obviously they can't do that because they're being funded to produce more. So it's a vicious cycle that cannot be solved that I just wanted to point out and talk about today. And that is the end of the episode. I'm sorry, this episode wasn't really about anything in particular, except for me kind of ranting about think tanks and just that I think think tank analysis of China is worthless, actually. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you liked it, please like it on whatever platform you are listening to it or viewing it on. Something that actually this episode made me realize is that I don't know anything about the Gulf War. So you guys are a bunch of nerds. I know, I read your emails. So if you have any good non-fiction Gulf War recommendations, please drop me a comment or an email. If you're interested in reading the full manuscript for this episode, you can go over to Buy Me a Coffee, become a member and view it there. And if you want to read more of my writings about think tanks, but also about other subjects, please do head over to my Substack, which is also called Sinobabble, and become a subscriber for free there today. Thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you in the next episode.